Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and Happy New Year. Due to travel time, family time, and sick time, we have a rebroadcast of one of our favorite episodes, episode number 179 with Dr. David Gruder. It's that time of year where we start to lay out our plans for the coming year, so Dr. Gruder is here to help make sure you're dreaming big enough. Dr. Gruder is an organizational and clinical psychologist, a best-selling author, and a great example of blazing your own trail. How can your business start being proactive instead of reacting to market changes? What can you do to make your C-suite more dynamic? And what are the advantages of walking in both the academic and the entrepreneurial world? Dr. Gruder, Otis, and I dive into all this and much more on this fantastic episode. Quick reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. You can also find the full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And if you learned something from Dr. Gruder, Otis, or me in our conversation, make sure to share this episode with someone else so they can learn it too. This episode is brought to you by Tribe and Purpose. The transition from college to that first career is a difficult one, and it's even harder when you lose your sense of identity. If you're an athlete who just hung up the cleats, it's hard to go from being a rugby player to being Joe in accounting. We created Next is Best to help retired college athletes use their skills to create an impact through entrepreneurship. Next is Best by Know Your Tribe will help to smoothen that rough transition by helping you establish a clear sense of purpose, an actionable path to success, and the tools you need to manage your life. Your 20s are a confusing and chaotic time. Next is Best gives you the tools you need to make sense of the chaos and make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. You can learn more about Next is Best by Know Your Tribe at findyourpurpose.coach. That's findyourpurpose.coach. Now here's Cam and Otis with the show.
Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. On this episode, man, we're gonna get into some fun stuff with my good buddy Dr. David Gruder. And you know, your name sings with doctor in front of it. I don't know if that's what drove you to becoming a doctor, but it just sounds right. Dr. David Gruder. I mean, David, good to see you, man. Good to have you on the show.
Good to see you too. And that's a story in and of itself, but that's not why I got my doctorate, but I could tell you that story.
Yeah, well, you know, looking you up and just kind of following you and knowing you for a little bit now, I see a dichotomy, and this is a little bit of an Otisism, but I see an academic who loves to start entrepreneur ventures, start new things, and that to me that's a dichotomy. I know I have some friends who are academics, I have some friends who are entrepreneurs, and there's usually a line there. And it seems like you're walking that line, David. Tell us why that is. What is it that excites you about starting new things?
Right. Well, it's very interesting because I know that I'm viewed as an academic, and yet my career has been in entrepreneurship. I'm basically the entrepreneurial academic in a sense. It's not unusual for me to bridge worlds. That seems to be part of my my chemistry, part of my makeup. My interest is in bringing the portions of academic knowledge that are valuable in a boots on the ground, practical way in individual development, in business development, and in societal well-being into everyday application. So in a sense, I suppose we could call me an applied academic, but my career has not been primarily around holding academic positions, although I am an adjunct faculty, but I'm very inactive in that role.
Where did the spark come from? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, which direction did this flow? Were you the entrepreneur who wanted more knowledge, or were you in school and then you were like, oh my gosh, I got this idea I want to run with? Which direction did that go?
That's a fascinating question, Camden, because here's what happened. When I was about 16, I was on a path to become a professional musician. In fact, nobody asked me, what university are you going to? They asked me, what conservatory of music are you going to? Mm-hmm. And much to the chagrin of my multiple music teachers at that time, I knew at 16 that even though music was my first love, and in many ways is my first love, psychology was my calling. And that the reason that psychology was my calling was because I was supposed to have some significant impact in the world. That was not clear to me what that was at that point, but what was clear was that I was supposed to have significant impact. And the reason that I launched out on a path to get my doctorate, which is in both clinical psychology and organizational development psychology, was simply, I didn't really care about the doctorate. I still don't, honestly. What I cared about was having the degree and the licensure that would give me society's approval to be a renegade. And so when I was finishing up grad school in the final couple of years of my doctoral program, there was nothing that was attractive to me about going into a setting where I was working for someone else or working in a clinic or working in an academic institution, although I had held a position in an academic institution prior to that. But what the only path for me was being an independent entrepreneurial psychologist. And so that was true for me from the very get-go.
So was it a buck the system sort of thought, or was it,
was that buck with a B, Dad?
Yeah.
David, I saw your face too. You heard it.
What? Making fun of?
No, you just didn't pronounce the B.
The other four-letter word. Yes. You could say. I just wasn't going to say it. I didn't mean to say it. Was that a Freudian slip? There we go.
Ask the doctor.
Oh, probably. It might have been a Jungian slip, but we won't go there. In any event, my makeup is as a world walker. And what I mean by that is that I seem to be endowed with an ability to go into a wide range of settings and speak the language of that setting. So, for example, one of my areas of expertise is a specialty area in psychology, which is a pretty renegade area called energy psychology. And for our listeners, the most well-known member of the energy psychology family is EFT, emotional freedom techniques, also called tapping. And I have given medical grand rounds on tapping. So I can have conventional doctors and nurses eating out of my hands, even though I'm talking about something that would appear on the surface to be pretty flaky and woo-woo. So the renegade in me operates oftentimes inside of conventional settings in order to be a pot stirrer. And I think where that fully got activated in me was when I was 15 years old and my parents sent me to Woodstock.
Like the Woodstock?
The Woodstock.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Which is its own story, and I'm happy to share it. But
yeah.
There's that part of me that's sort of the never recovering hippie, and the other part of me that was really trained to operate and function effectively in a conventional world.
So what I'm wondering about is this: was it this I guess deep curiosity, kind of I'm picturing the young kid that's going, why that, Dad? Why is the sky blue? Why is the car go that way? And then as you got older, maybe the guy who's like peeling the onion back and going, what's this? Well, let me see what else. Is it that sort of thing that drove you so hard?
It really is in a lot of ways. When I was in elementary school, I really was pretty, I fit the stereotype of the typical outcast, the one who was bullied and stuff like that. And it was really because as I have the wisdom now to look back on it, I see that it was because I was a high functioning autistic and I didn't know that. And autism wasn't terribly well known at that point in time. and my form of autism was fairly mild, so it would never have been diagnosed. And what I remember, because of my parents were both also high functioning autistics, I made a decision in 4th or 5th grade that my parents did not understand how the world worked, and my brother certainly didn't. He's 3 years younger than me, and he was a full-blown childhood autistic. I made a decision that because my parents, in my opinion, didn't understand how the world worked, it was on my shoulders to figure out how the world worked for them and for me. And so that's really what launched the peeling of the onion for me, starting at a really unusually young age.
That reminds me of a conversation we had recently around the, personalities being coping mechanisms, that you're just finding your way inside your family and that becomes your personality trait. And I could see that with you, how you built that personality trait younger and then carried it on into your professional world. As you already kind of mentioned that you wanted, the reason you pursued the doctorate was, and to belittle it a little bit because it's fun, is, the piece of paper that you could show people and say, hey, look, I'm a doctor. I know what I'm talking about. Looking out, not just in your case, but kind of broadening that a little bit for other people.
Yeah.
What do you think should be the approach for people that have that thirst for knowledge, but then may recognize that academia may not be the most impactful path forward, or, just expensive at the very least?
Right. Well, a great question, because as we know, some of the most brilliant, in fact, in my experience, many of the most brilliant entrepreneurs were not people who were bookworms. They barely finished high school, or they may have put in a couple of years of college, or they might have graduated college, but that the academic pathway was not their pathway. The innovation pathway and the business focus kind of pathway was their pathway. And so what I would say is that wisdom in this world is profoundly plentiful in virtually every single walk of life, and that it is absolutely not necessary to become an academic in order to get smart, or in order to get wise, or in order to be successful. I think what's really, really important is right matching. There are some people who, like me, and I didn't know this even when I was in high school, I only discovered this in college, were right matched for an academic route to success. There are other people who will flounder and get frustrated and bored, and it'll just feel irrelevant to them to take an academic route. And their pathway is much more through the working world, the business world, the non-academic world.
How did people recognize that? That sounds like a really, what an amazing tool for, really anybody, but, particularly, and I'll get on a little bit of my soapbox as a former high school rugby coach, is all these young men who had been told their entire life that they got to go to college because that's the only way to be successful. And they go and they just flop in that first semester because it's not for them, right? They weren't right matched. And and they would come back home literally and be labeled as failures. And it was just so sad to see for those young men to start life off like that at 18, 19 years old. So what's the easy, well, I don't want to say easy because, I'll steal it from Camden. I don't want to belittle it. But is there a way that folks could kind of like say A or B, and which one may work for me?
Yes, I think there is. And I think the key to the and I agree with you, easy is not quite the right word, to the smoother path for each individual is follow your passion. One of the blessings that I got from my parents in growing up was that they were very supportive of me exploring whatever my passions happened to be within their limited means, because I didn't grow up in a wealthy family. But my parents had a huge emphasis and a huge passion on education in the broadest sense of the word, which, education comes from the Greek for educare, which means to bring forth from within.
Mm.
The educational system has kind of forgotten that, but that's a whole other story. What they meant by education was notice what you get intrigued by and plunge into it. And by continually doing that, you will discover your path. You'll discover what's right for you. And so when people are, like you were talking about, Otis, as a rugby coach, when these young men were being forced or pushed in a pathway to success, they were being treated in like a one-size-fits-all delusion. And what would have been wiser would have been for them to be passion matched. Like in my high school, we had kids who it seemed pretty clear were college bound, but we also had kids who were vocation bound, and they had their own programs that they got to participate in, which were hands-on, real world, learn a craft, learn a skill kinds of programs, and they weren't pushed in a college bound direction. So it's really about, there's an expression in Italian, segui il cuore, which means follow your heart. And I think that is the smoothest path to success.
And I think one big piece of that a lot of people, kind of looking back, I might have get missed out on, but a lot of people in that like high school age, transitioning age, is understanding the system that you're looking at as well. Because I know a lot of people who had the passion for what they went and studied, but they kind of like you were saying, they don't fit into the system at all. They were going to get bored, even though they were studying something fascinating that they love. They would rather be at home reading the books at their own pace, doing those kind of things. How do you differentiate between the academic pathway versus the knowledge pursuit in that sense? Because to me, like a lot of people who want to follow their passions, there's this passion there. They want to read, get into all these type of things, but then jamming that passion into a system that's not right for them is beat it out of them. Like a lot of people have their passions beat out of them in various levels of school.
Yes. Unfortunately true. I think that the important distinction for people to be looking for and discovering inside themselves is whether they're intuitively or naturally or organically drawn toward skills development, hands-on experience, or if they're intuitively drawn to abstract academic knowledge. If the academic knowledge pathway is what calls to them most strongly as a first step toward, succeeding in the world, then that's a really important sign to go through some kind of academic training. If they're hands-on people, then it's not. I can tell you, can I tell you a quick story about that?
Please.
Yeah, please.
Please do.
So many decades ago, when I was working in the schools, actually, I was sent a student. I was in a really kind of privileged role in the sense that I was not a school psychologist in the sense of, school psychologists generally do a bunch of testing for placing kids in the proper program and stuff like that. I was actually doing organizational development in helping administrators become better administrators and faculty become better teachers. And I did counseling with students, not testing. So I had this student who came to me because his math teacher had said something to him that was absolutely devastating. The student had ambitions to become a pilot. He wanted to fly airplanes. And his math teacher said, you know, you really suck at math. You might as well give up. Don't even bother trying to become a pilot. And he was absolutely devastated by that input. So he comes to me to try to sort that through. And in the process of starting to get to know him, I learned that he was a drummer. And so I asked him how he learned how to perform pieces. Was he reading the score? You know, was he reading notes, or how did he do it? And he said, no, I listened to the music a few times and I work it out on the drums. And so I immediately knew that he was a hands-on learner, not an academic learner. And so I pulled out a tool for hands-on learners to learn math, which is something called Cuisenaire rods. And that's kind of exotic. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is that it's a tool for people who don't learn math in the usual ways that math is taught, to learn math in a hands-on, you know, literally kinesthetic, hands-on manner. And suddenly, through doing that with him, he realized, oh my gosh, I can learn math. And the problem is not that I'm an idiot. The problem is my teacher doesn't know how to teach me. Mm-hmm. And that set him back on the path of his passion. He stopped believing the false belief that he was stupid. And so he was a great example of someone who can whose best learning pathway was hands-on, not abstract academic.
Yeah. When you talk about other pathways for learning, you know, talking about like hands-on, and honestly, this is one where I can't name many other pathways. I know they exist, and I'm, you know, but not going to stress myself over that. What I'm thinking is, looking forward and trying to patch these types of holes of, you know, what is essentially a pipeline for people getting out into the real world and, you know, being effective adults and participating members of society, is there's one approach that I think is the first one that comes to mind for people, which is academia fixing its system, you know, getting, you know, high school more options for hands-on learners and, you know, getting those different routes for people. And so that's the one option that comes to mind. Then there's this other one that's really coming up as we're talking about your background, which is entrepreneurial academics, which is you going out and doing it and learning as you go in that same pursuit of knowledge. I guess the question there is, do you think that it's a little bit like idealistic, taking the problem out of our hands to say academia, fix yourself, rather than the rest of us, you know, entrepreneurs going out there and setting up other systems that can supplement that pipeline?
Yeah, I think the idealism, the idealistic kind of track for that would be leaving it to academia to figure this out for themselves. Mm-hmm. I think that the way, what I've seen over the course of my career is that the way that that institutions change is through consumer demand. Mm-hmm. When consumer demand grows to a particular level, the mainstream of whatever market segment we're talking about, whether it's academia or the field of medicine or whatever it happens to be, they start to discover that they're missing out on a profit center. And when they realize they're missing out on a profit center, that's when they mobilize. And I'll give you two concrete examples of that, one from academia and one from medicine. From academia, the conventional MBA, the Master's in Business Administration, those conventional versions of that degree really didn't teach people how to be entrepreneurs. The conventional MBA taught people how to be cogs in a corporate wheel. Mm-hmm. And because of growing consumer demand for more sophisticated ways of becoming entrepreneurs for those who were more academically minded, suddenly we started seeing the proliferation of entrepreneurial MBA degrees. right? And it wasn't like academic institutions thought, oh, well, this would be a really cool thing to do. It was consumer demand. They realized there was a profit center there. In medicine, back in the 1970s, I was an administrator for what was the very first professional organization in the field of integrative medicine. And back then it was called holistic health. And at that point in time, in the mid 70s, there was no demand for that. And so, mainstream medical institutions thought it was quackery and woo-woo stuff and all of that. Fast forward into the early 1990s, mid 1990s, all of a sudden we're seeing in very mainstream hospital systems, departments of integrative medicine, centers for integrative medicine popping up. They didn't do that because they thought, oh yeah, this is a cool idea. We're gonna be at the forefront. They did that because consumer demand for those services had grown between the 1970s and the 1990s to the point where there was a profit center they were missing out on. That's how you create change.
Where did this now kind of, I'm thinking more in the Dr. Gruder chronology. Where did you get into the business aspect of this? Because you've done some really deep dive into the business, the leadership side and the business, design side. I mean, you didn't think of that when you were 16, did you?
Not only did I not think of that when I was 16, it was completely off my radar because my mom was a, classic 1950s, 1960s person who actually gave up her passion to become a mom.
She was Bieber's mom, right?
She was. And my dad was a corporate guy. I mean, actually, he started off as an accountant, as an IRS, an Internal Revenue Service agent, and then worked his way through law school at night and became an attorney and worked in a corporation for the rest of his career. So my father's idea of success was cog in a wheel. Yeah. There was no entrepreneurial training in my family, I can tell you. It was purely seat of my pants intuition, because I realized that even though I did okay being employed in my teens and in my No, my computer didn't die, but my internet connection died. I don't know what happened. I'm on wired internet, so it's not a Wi-Fi issue. I'm calling on my cell phone now.
Well, the audio is fine. If you okay, you want to put in, you got your earpiece with you, that might make it a little bit easier so you don't have to hold the phone in front of you.
Well, I have a phone holder that
okay.
I might use. Let me see how that will do.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, the background's not the greatest.
That's all right.
And I'm going to keep trying to rejoin while we're doing this.
Okay. So we were talking just to kind of, and I'll do an action sort of thing for Norman when he edits this. But we were talking a little bit about your transition, realization of the business side of it. And I think Camden, you said David was right in my teens.
When I was a teen was when the last part of it I heard. Yeah.
Well, with all this trying to figure out what had gone wrong, I totally lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no worries. So here's the question. We'll set it up, and then I'll say, all right, let's go, and that'll cue Norman. But it was you did all this stuff, kind of the internal, the personal thing, and then you shifted now to organizational development, organizational management, and leadership. So I'm kind of curious what was that path? And Norman, we'll start that right about now.
Right. So what I was saying was that I did not grow up in an entrepreneurial family. And in grad school, we were kind of being trained as psychologists with the assumption that we were going to go into private practice as psychologists. And not everyone did, but that was kind of the spoken and unspoken expectation. And yet we weren't given any training at all in entrepreneurship. And I, for any psychologists who are listening to this, or academics who are listening to this, this is not a criticism, because it was all we could do. I mean, it was so time consuming to just learn our craft, to learn our trade. There was no energy or time left over to learn how to become an entrepreneur simultaneously. So there's no implied criticism here. There's just a what is, which is that here I was in the first half of the 1980s with my doctorate, having no training in entrepreneurship. And so in essence, after I got my doctorate, my education began. All I knew was that I needed to function and practice independently. I was blessed with opportunities, not only as a psychotherapist. At that time, I no longer provide psychotherapy because of other focuses in my career. But at that time, I was doing a combination of psychotherapy, teaching, and consulting, and then started doing more and more training and workshops and keynotes and things along those lines. And it was in the process of doing those activities that I realized I got to learn how to be an entrepreneur. I have to learn what it means to be self-employed and how to do that in a good way.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cam Otis Show. If you're enjoying this conversation, then make sure to share it with other lifelong learners in your life. Stay up to date with the show on Facebook and Instagram at Cam Otis Show, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so that you're the first one to hear about new episodes and other special content. Now let's get back to the show.
That's a fascinating path in the sense of, and I'll throw this out there too. Friends who are dentists and lawyers, same thing. It's nobody taught them how to start, the injury business or become a lawyer. They all my friends who are lawyers all started off working for somebody else. Dentist, almost every dentist I've ever known, to include some close friends, all start off the same way because they never get taught this is how you run a business. And I think that's an interesting thing that there's your business idea.
That's a really important point, because what you're describing is the apprenticeship model.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't been formally thought of that way, but this is the way we traditionally in society learned a craft or learned a trade or learned a profession, was through apprenticing to someone who was hopefully a master at whatever that was, right?
Right.
And yet a lot of these, I've done a lot of consulting to professionals who have been in private practice, whether attorneys or accountants or healthcare professionals or psychotherapists or coaches, and they're functioning in a private practice, but they're doing it by the seat of their pants. They've got no clue about how to do it on purpose as an effective entrepreneur.
It's got me thinking of, because even if you're not wanting to truly be an entrepreneur, of just like how impactful those lessons can be just for, those normal people, almost how I said it. But that when it's almost like you need, you talk those like freshman, sophomore years of college, and you do those gen eds and those type of things. It's almost like you need an entrepreneurship class, because I can think of so many people I've talked to who have zero interest in owning their own business, being an entrepreneur, doing any of those type of things. But I just explained to them the same kind of concepts of valuing yourself as your work, and just those little things of treating yourself like a business. And then how do you value yourself when you go into a job interview and those kind of things, and how impactful that can be it's almost like the real world training that people need to get out of school and be, adjust, because it's just, this is the way things work. You are a person going into a company, you have to show your value. Otherwise they're not going to let you in. And those type of things aren't going to go away. It's not, it's not against the academic idea of learning these things and getting that high level knowledge. It's just that how do you translate that knowledge into the real world?
Yes, very, very much so. And actually, you're bringing back another piece of the puzzle for me, which happened as an undergraduate, where I was thrust into a real world kind of circumstance in a couple of ways. But the one that I'm particularly thinking of was that as a student, I was appointed to the master planning committee for the university. So the university was going through this planning process for mapping out the next 50 or so years in its development, which is what master planning is building long range plans inside of which the near-term strategic plan ideally grows. And so I had no background in any of that. I didn't even know what master planning was, but I was thrust into the deep end of the pool as a master planning committee member. And I learned through apprenticeship how to do long-term planning for business development. In this case, it was the university's development, but it was the university as a business. It wasn't academic training. It was real life entrepreneurial training. And so that was kind of put into my DNA as an undergrad. And so I was really blessed with having been thrown into the deep end of that pool. And that serves me to this day because most strategic planners haven't been trained in long range master planning.
That actually sets up another question I had written down, which is inside of the organizational structure, talking about them responding to the consumer demand. How, in your experience, how do you switch that to be proactive rather than reactive? Because as much as, taking it from the entrepreneur side, as much as you want to, be a demand-based business where there's already the demand there, the visionaries who are setting the plans for 15 years from now are going to make a lot more money eventually. And so it's like, how do you flip that mindset in an organization?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, short answer, please. So that's easy question. Come on.
Yeah, short answer. So, good point. Stephen Covey, in his most famous book, the late Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of those principles he called begin with the end in mind. And from my perspective, he almost got it right. It's begin with the best possible end in mind. And so the way that translates into a business setting is envisioning at the front end what you think, what you believe. Now it's going to alter over time, but you got to have some kind of starting place. So getting your first vision of what you ideally want this business to look like when it's all grown up. And then you reverse engineer. So once you know what you ideally want it to be when it's all grown up, then you go back to the here and now and ask the question, where am I in that journey toward growing this business all the way up? And then you build a bridge from where you are toward where you would like it to be. And that is the master planning process, essentially. So that's kind of the short answer to how you do it. Businesses that don't start with that reverse engineering approach, they just simply throw spaghetti against the wall, do trial and error, and end up wondering why they're constantly in crisis mode rather than in proactive planning mode. And it's because they didn't start with a vision of what they wanted the business to be when it was all grown up.
Oh, that's awesome. And without getting into that's the way we do it in the military too, and the whole way of translating. But we do. What I'd love to dive into is what's that trend, because you've been doing these sort of things. You've been doing this a lot with executives. What's like a trend, like 5 out of 10 or whatever, that's what they're doing wrong, or or that problem set that you just love to dive into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I can distill it down to a couple of things, especially in the current times in the 2020s, which is that most of these executives have not been trained in how to be what I call upheaval literate.
That's an interesting phrase, upheaval literate.
Yeah,
okay.
Upheaval literacy is one of the key entrepreneurial skills and executive skills of our time, from my perspective. And these executives are just jumping from crisis to crisis simply because society and the economy are all in such a state of upheaval. And so when they're jumping from crisis to crisis, they're in reactivity mode. They're not in the mode of looking at what's going on and asking themselves the question, what opportunity does this open up for us? Rather than how do we stem the bleeding? How do we stop bleeding? And inside of that, the big dilemma that executives constantly are talking about is that it's really difficult for them to find competent personnel. The personnel may be technically trained in whatever it is that they're hiring them to fill a position for, but they aren't trained in what's often referred to as the soft skills. And so what they've got is these employees who lack two key pieces that the executives were never taught how to train their employees in. One is tensions competence, and that is the ability to sit in the mystery of the unknown and not get seduced into either or black and white thinking, but instead to look for the common threads. What's the both and in this situation, rather than getting polarized or divisive in their thinking. I call that tensions competence. And then the other is impact literacy. And what that is that so many people that are in the workforce today, in the younger generations in particular, have no clue how to gauge the impact of their choices. And they've been trained in something that in psychology is called learned helplessness, meaning that they have absorbed a belief that nothing positive they do has any positive impact, and nothing negative they do has any negative impact. So they just do what they do, and if it falls short, well, kind of tough, I'm entitled to a raise anyhow because I've showed up. And this drives executives crazy, but the problem is that these executives have never been taught how to teach their employees impact literacy, how to assess cause and effect, how to be accountable, in ways that don't have nothing to do with punishment or shaming or guilt or manipulation, but simply having to do with taking responsibility for the impacts that the choices we make about how we utilize our life energy have on those to whom we've made commitments. I know I just said a mouthful there, but this is what the vast majority of executives are dealing with, is they don't know how to deal with upheavals in a proactive way, and they don't know how to teach their employees the missing soft skills that their employees need in order to collaborate effectively, be highly engaged, and flourish in a volatile, polarized, divisive culture.
You hit on something that just reminded me. So I remember when my dad was still, so dad is a retired rocket scientist, so a doctorate and all that sort of stuff. But I remember him telling me 25 years ago, at least, complaining about that exact same thing. The guys coming out of college were great with the tools. They could do the math, they could do the higher level math and design, but they couldn't take their thoughts and put it into a concise statement. And I remember Dad just because Dad old school, a few years before you, but 4 years of literature and English and all that sort of stuff as he's becoming an engineer. And that was, I just remember. So that's it. That's a problem that obviously hasn't been fixed yet. If you're still identifying it with today's executives, where these guys that I'm hiring are technically competent, but they cannot do maybe it's critical thinking. Would you call it critical thinking, David? Would you call that?
Part of it is that they weren't trained in critical thinking because of the deterioration in the education system, and part of it is that they weren't trained in how to collaborate effectively, and they also weren't trained in and here's a really big key. They weren't trained in how to understand how to maintain their passion in their work. They didn't know how to connect their impact mission in the world as a human being. They didn't even know what their impact mission was with their roles or jobs' true value to the business, with the business's true value to its customers first and foremost, and society in general secondarily. And that kind of lack of what I call vertical integrity, aligning my personal impact mission with knowing what portions of my personal impact mission I get to express through my role and my job in helping my business, the business that I'm in, fulfill its mission, its impact mission, its true value as a business. Without that vertical integrity, people don't stay engaged. They don't grow. They don't develop the passion to grow parts of themselves that they didn't get taught about in school in order to really flourish in business.
So I want to play devil's advocate a little bit here with y'all, because as we're talking about, the people coming out of college not having these same skills, it kind of brings me back to the conversation earlier about, is it idealistic to want academia to fix all these problems? Or is there, another entrepreneurial solution there? One of the interesting things I've heard about connecting academia to the real world, if you want to put it that way, is that you have these academics who can have this plethora of knowledge, but they can't tell any normal person about it because there's so much jargon, and all those layers of jargon are just make it impossible for the normal person to understand. And then it creates this opportunity for other people who have the ability to understand that knowledge and then synthesize it in a way that other people can understand. I think my favorite example of this is Stephen Dubner with Freakonomics, that he's not a great, I think he says it all the time. I'm not a great economist, but gosh darn, does he have an amazing podcast that gets a lot of people interested in economics and synthesizes those amazing ideas. And so my devil's advocate statement there a little bit is it necessary that we try to teach everybody that? Or is there a little bit of division of labor that needs to be happening where you have people who have that super high level knowledge, and then we just need other people to be able to synthesize it for them? Every nerd with their stack of books needs somebody who can explain it walking behind them, that type of thing.
Great question. And the only thing that, before I get to my response, the only modification I would offer to you is I think you're playing angel's advocate, not devil's advocate.
Oh, I love that phrase. I'm using that from now on.
The division of labor, I think, is very, very important. One of the problems that I see right now, which led to my current co-author and me writing the next two books of mine and his that are going to be released in September of 2022, is that business structures today are designed both in terms of executive structure and in terms of culture. They were designed for product-based economy. And we've gone beyond product-based markets to the experiential economy and now into the transformation economy, meaning that people used to be manipulated into buying products and services, and then they got a little more sophisticated, and consumers wanted to purchase a great experience through the product or service they offered, the business offered. And now what consumers are wanting is not just simply a great experience, but they're wanting purpose and meaning through the product or service they buy. And the business structure is not designed for the transformation economy. So this is a long way around of getting to your question, but I wanted to give that backdrop so that my response makes sense, which is that we need to divide the executive suite into the strategic executives and the tactical executives. So strategists aren't tacticians, and they shouldn't be saddled with having to figure out how to implement the strategy. Strategists should develop the strategy, and tacticians shouldn't be saddled with having to figure out strategy, because their strength is the how, not the why and the what. And then the implementers do not need to be either strategists or tacticians. They need to be boots on the ground. How are we going to get it done, people? And when you've got people in the right seat on the bus, where you've got the strategist in a strategist role, you've got the tactical tactics selection executives in the tactical role, and the implementers in the implementation role, then you have a real life solution to the dilemma you were just describing.
That's great. And I'm gonna put a plug in for my veteran brothers out there, because they understand that. They understand that, you know, at this level of my life, my career, what I'm doing, my job is just to do it. And then at this level, the next level up, my job is to kind of maneuver that. And then, and by the way, the military, for those of you who don't know, the military has a strategy school that guys go to for 6-9 months. I did not go to that school, but where they are, that is their gig. They are strategists. They're the guys who are thinking about that big picture, little hand sort of thing of, we're going to do some operations over here, we're going to do some business over here, and that level. So that is a great point. I mean, that's one of the ways that you know, our military, the U.S. military, has been so successful. Well, we won't go down that rabbit hole either. But
no, it's a great point. And one of the things that I was blessed with when I was just before my 21st birthday, I was hired by the president of the university I was going to as an undergrad to be his administrative assistant. And the president of my university at that time was someone who had come into this university presidency from having been a Marine Corps colonel who was an undersecretary of defense, and then prior to that headed up the War College. Yeah. And he was a marvelous mentor for me, because he had exactly that kind of mindset that you just described, Otis.
Yeah. I want to shift gears.
Sorry, before you shift gears, I wanted to add one thing on that, you know, we were talking about, you know, the uncertainty that people are dealing with in the 2020s and how that, you know, how that works into business and everything. And I think the interesting thing that I'm realizing, coming a little bit full circle on this, is, you know, when you talk about the strategists and tacticians and implementers, they all live in different worlds, essentially, where their understanding of the world that they're operating in, to create certainty so that they are able to operate, they have to live in that different world. If you expect implementators, wow, that really struggling on that word, I'm gonna go ahead, to understand some big picture strategy, you know, to sit in on the C-suite meeting where you're going through the pre-mortem of all the things that could possibly go wrong with the business, they're going to freak out and they're not going to be able to do their job anymore. And I think the eye-opening moment for me on that is that continues all the way up. That the tacticians, gosh, I'm struggling on the words we need in the podcast. The tacticians, if you expect them to step up into that next world, that uncertainty is going to hurt their productivity just the same. And as much as, there are people like David, you mentioned you're one of those yourself, that are able to go in between worlds. It's a very important thing, but we shouldn't expect everybody to be able to do that. Because if you do, honestly, I've had this, I could use the example of Norman, our producer here, when he and I were working on one of our startups. There were a couple of times where I sat him down and I laid out some big stuff, and I saw him freeze for like 3 days in work, where he like couldn't do anything because he was just like, wait, but so how are we going to market the? I was like, okay, sorry. I'm never telling you that stuff again, unless you ask, like, we need to step out from it, because I opened up Pandora's box to him and it shattered the world that he was living in. And it created a lot of uncertainty. So I think it's really important to recognize just that people are living in those different worlds, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's natural, because you need to create certainty in order to be productive.
Beautifully, beautifully said. And my add-on to that is that there is going to be a percentage of implementers who show an interest in and a potential to master tactician kinds of capabilities. And there are going to be a percentage of tacticians who have who become intrigued with strategy. And when you know in a business, and I'm constantly working with businesses on this, when you know how to identify those people and know how to nurture that intrinsic interest that some of those individuals have, you end up with an internal succession plan process. And the military, going back to the military, when the military's functioning really well, it knows how to do that. It knows how to spot which implementers have the potential to become managers, if you will, to lead small groups, and which of those leaders of small groups have the potential to become strategists, right? And so it's not rocket science, although unfortunately not enough executives are trained in how to identify, and more importantly, how to nurture and train those folks. And they don't do conscious architecture of succession planning from within in those ways. When a business does that, it thrives, because it's constantly giving people who want to move from implementer to tactician, or tactician to strategist, pathways to accomplish that, even if there's no role for them to do that in that company. Then they move to another company in order to in order to move into that new role. Healthy businesses take joy in people leaving for the right reasons, because that company doesn't have that next step up for those people. What happens instead in these companies is something called the Peter Principle, which a lot of people don't know about anymore, but it was a very famous book back in the day. And what the Peter Principle says is that people are promoted to their highest level of incompetence. They are thrust into roles that they either didn't have the aptitude for, or they because they really excelled in their prior role, or where they had some potential to fill the new role that they were promoted into, but they were thrown into the deep end of the pool with no training and no mentorship and no apprenticeship. And so they floundered because they didn't get what they needed in order to succeed. And that's a nuts way. That's a crazy way of conducting business, and yet it's incredibly common.
I want to, what I was shifting gears to, and you've touched on this a little bit, but what's the next thing that executives should keep an eye out for? That trend, the problem
robots.
set. Yeah, robots. What is that next thing, David? Because you've been doing this. You've got a great vision for what's going on. What do you think's next?
Wow, that's a really broad question. Maybe we can narrow it down so that I don't have to give you a half-hour long answer. Next in terms of what? Next in terms of society, next in terms of business, next in terms of
business leaders, business executive leaders. What should they be looking out for in the next trend of problem sets?
Well, it's going to be a combination of two things. One is that they need to always have their finger on the pulse of macro trends, meaning trends that are going on in society, in the economy, in the development of humanity. And I'll unpack that in a second, but just kind of at a high level first. And the other set of trends that they need to be aware of is how the business culture marketplace is changing. What employees are really looking for in being employed in a business today versus 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So there's the macro level, which is the economic and societal and government regulations level of things. And then there's the more internal or micro level having to do with how do we restructure our corporate structure and our company culture to flourish inside of today's macro factors. So those are the two kind of broad categories. And if you want me to unpack either of those in more detail, I'm happy to do that.
No, that's a great seed planter. Because I was thinking, you mentioned we were a product-based economy, and now I've forgotten one of them.
Then experience-based and now transformation-based.
Transformational. Is there a next thing that you see coming?
Beyond the transformation economy?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, yes. The transcendent economy. And what transcendent means, and this is a shorthand for, is that people moved from buying products or services to buying experiences through products or services to buying purpose through experiences with products or services. I see the next trend as people buying elevated consciousness, spiritually aligned consciousness, and I mean spiritual in the most broad sense of the term, with or without religion, but transcendent, buying elevated transcendent consciousness through purpose with a great experience, purchasing a product or service. That I think is the next evolution in the business marketplace, and I think we're still a few years off from that catching speed. Right now, the transformational economy, it has been estimated to be a $3 billion marketplace. So it's really catching on. Transcendent, nowhere near as big at this point. Not yet.
Wow, that's great. I appreciate you sharing with that your thoughts on that, which always at least makes me start to think about because we've talked about a lot and what did we learn and how do I choose the one thing, because what I'll go back to is the right matching. I love that thought process, and I'm hoping some school counselors are out there listening to our show and start to think about things in that sense, because there's a lot of kids who get told what you said, that young man who wanted to be a pilot and was told give it up. That still happens, which just breaks my heart when I hear those things. So I love that. And I've got a nephew who's a guitar player, and the way he plays the guitar is he hears it. He doesn't. I asked him the other day, "Can you read music?" And he said, "What do you mean? You can. There's music that's written down. How would you?" And he's a good guitar player too. All in that, by hand learning. So I've got to call him and just check on him and see where he's going with that, because that's great insights to that. So I appreciate that. Camden, how about you? What'd you learn?
I was gonna say that's that nephew. That's Bobby Ray Vaughan. That's what I call him.
That's right.
But no, what I learned, David, you were talking about tensions, competence, and that it's not either or, it's both. And I just think that's such an important thing moving forward. That I think talking about living in those different worlds and creating your own certainty and that kind of stuff. The world is going to be so full of uncertainty that's never going to change. And you just have to be able to live inside of that. You have to figure out what world inside of those three that you want to live in so that you can create some uncertainty in your life. And the big takeaway on the both, and I think about this a lot, that if you see someone else's idea, and this tends to fall into political spectrum things just because it's easy to paint that example. But if you see somebody across the aisle that has a different idea about solving a problem than you do, take it with, maybe take this with a grain of salt. But they're probably just as right as you are, and you're probably just as wrong as they are, because you're probably both looking at about half the problem. And if you start to approach problems that way, you not only get more comfortable inside of that uncertainty, but then also you're going to find a lot better solutions in the long term.
Beautifully said.
Awesome. David, how about you? What'd you learn?
Well, what I learned is that there's still a whole lot of interest in the kind of the big picture conceptual understandings that we covered, which is kind of different from what my primary focus is, which is the boots on the ground. How do you do step-by-step implementation? This is part of what separates me from conventional academics, because yes, I can talk on high-level philosophical or conceptual frames. I can certainly, that world is fun for me. But where my passion is translating the concepts we were talking about today, all of the concepts we were talking about today, into step-by-step procedures for walking the talk, for implementing the solution, rather than talking endlessly about, these high-level concepts and never getting to the boots on the ground level. And that's really what differentiates me from academics.
That's awesome. Now, you mentioned 2 books coming out in September of 22. Can you tell us about it? Can you drop some ideas, some teasers? Let us know.
Sure. So my co-author, Mark S.A. Smith, and I have written 2 interconnected books. One is called The Nimble C-Suite, and the other is called The Nimble Company. And the Nimble C-Suite is on how to restructure the executive suite into 2 suites, into an S suite, which is the strategic suite, and the T suite, which is the tactical suite, so that these executives can really flourish inside of their sweet spot, whether it's strategic or it's tactical, rather than getting everybody all confused with trying to turn one into the other. And then the Nimble Company is about how to restructure the company culture. And both of these interwoven books are specifically for businesses that want to flourish in the transformational economy as socially responsible businesses. It's not for the businesses that are still functioning in the product-based economy. It's for the transformational economy businesses who have already recognized that the traditional way of structuring the executive team and the culture doesn't work for a transformation economy-based business, but they don't know what a framework is to replace that with. And we unpack at great detail how to restructure companies that want to take that journey.
Oh, I'm excited because I love both those subject areas. That's, as you can imagine, just from talking today. So I'll be keeping my ear out for the release party for that one, David. I'm looking forward to it. How can people follow you, get in touch with you, learn more about what you got going on next?
Sure. A couple of ways. If you want to know what my futurist vision is about how to move into an elevated future as a species and as nations, go to revisioninghumanity.com, which you see in the upper corner of my background. If you want to learn about the range of things I offer as a business person, go to drgruder.com. That's drgruder.com. And if you want to be thinking more about the transition from transformation-based thinking into transcendent-based thinking, then go ahead and listen to the podcast that my wife Lori and I do, which is called The One Thing. And you can get to that directly through drgruder.com/TOT, TOT, which is the abbreviation for The One Thing podcast.
That's awesome. I'm glad you explained TOT because I wouldn't have gotten it.
and of course, I'm on all the social networks as well.
Oh, that's awesome, David. And I appreciate the great insight that you shared with us today and your thoughts. This is exciting, man. I've been sitting here thinking this whole time, thinking, all right, I get to listen. Sorry, folks, but I get to listen to this again before you even get it the first time. I'm just saying, privilege. But this has been amazing, David. I really appreciate your time, man.
My pleasure. And also what I probably should mention is that even as we're recording this, the Nimble C-Suite and the Nimble Company are available for pre-sale on Amazon, and they will be available in print version, Kindle, digital version, and audiobook version.
That's great. I'm glad you said that. So now we can get on the list. Awesome, man. Well, again, thank you very much for your time. Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank y'all for listening to the Cam Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guest, Dr. David Gruder, for joining us today. And of course, our sponsor, Tribe and Purpose. Find your tribe, find your purpose. Get started for free today at findyourpurpose.coach. Make sure to follow the Cam Otis Show on Instagram and Facebook, and please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening. Videos of the podcast are always available on our YouTube page, and you can always get a full archive of our episodes at thecamandotisshow.buzzsprout.com. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next time.